One of my biggest pet peeves in the games industry is how publishers handle game reveals. Some are better than others, sure, but every noteworthy one has a miss or two or three or more, and the gaming audience is almost entirely to blame for it in the modern age. Let's talk about it. In the early days of this industry, video games, consoles, and other related accessories were this thing that sort of just showed up. And the way people found out was, I don't know, going in the stores on random days and seeing them on the shelves, TV commercials, and magazine inserts. That was how things were done for 2 generations and some change. A developer's game being finished, the publisher would then, at least seemingly, randomly release that given game staggered across the world, and then advertise its existence after the fact through traditional print and televised media via news stories and paid advertisement, commonly as some sort of found phenomena that news anchors and the like had to inform the world's parents about so their kids could have a respectable childhood.
Short for Pocket Monsters, it is a Japanese video game which invaded the US last year, quickly becoming a popular cartoon series. Now kids are going just wild over this Pokemon and the stuffed animals and collectibles and Pokemon trading cards. So why is Pokemon so popular? It started, you said, as a video game, right?
It was a video game from Nintendo and Pocket Monster Pokemon about 3 years ago, and last year it was brought to television in the United States.
In an era that was all but devoid of the internet, especially as a means of promotion, and the ensuing dialogue that we take for granted today, you may assume this relative lack of straightforward targeted promotion to be a death knell for games, especially when you add to that the fact that at this point in time, gaming as a whole was a lot more of a niche market. Surprisingly, for many games, you'd be wrong, and that's made evident by the astronomical numbers some of the best sellers on early consoles pulled. That said, although these numbers aren't as readily available, I'd be willing to bet games that aren't the forefathers of franchises we still know today struggled because of the aimless approach to game releases back then. Feel free to fact check me in the comments if you're at all familiar with retro game sales. Like a lot of the poison we still have to deal with in modern gaming fandom, it took Sega of America's marketing team to strike oil and come across the power that was coordinating the release of a video game to launch at opportune times across as many markets as possible, and telling the world what day that game was coming out ahead of time for the rest of the games industry to realize that. Yeah, it turns out you'll sell more games if people know when they'll be able to buy them in advance. Retailers will be prepared and more inclined to make that known to their consumers, and even more importantly than that, for the purposes of this video, publishers now have a better way to drive buzz for their games. They don't even have to send the game to test markets, trade shows, or focus groups for this newly acquired buzz either. If you weren't aware, this strategy paid off in spades. Sonic 2 outsold Super Mario World in the US for quite some time, and it paved the way for their most successful period as a company. Making the release of a game an event is commonplace these days and doesn't seem like anything to write home about now, but back then, their Sonic Tuesday marketing campaign was truly revolutionary. Games are still frequently released on Tuesday to this day. Currently though, a lot more commonly than what should be the case, the way publishers go about announcing release dates feels less like a mutual benefit, with consumers being able to better plan their purchases, publishers getting the low impact buzz for upcoming releases, synergy for retail, and more like a cheap and dirty way to steal mindshare with no real commitment to announce a game within the window it would actually be announced and released on time. Too many studios strategically announce games with obvious placeholder release dates to artificially gain mindshare, when in actuality they have no real chance of honoring these dates, but go for them anyway for the buzz and acclaim, since that all generally leads to instant pre-orders and preemptive console purchases, which means happy shareholders and frequently spikes in the market value of that given company. And that's worth way more than the relatively temporary disappointment from fans when a game is pushed back, or in some cases even canceled for one reason or another. Just in the last decade, I've seen many high-profile examples of release dates for games being announced only for them to be subsequently delayed weeks later, and this has been true years prior to COVID. Red Dead Redemption 2 comes to mind, for example. These days, this kind of abuse of the marketing power power that comes with announcing new games goes unnoticed by the gaming audience at large because of either of these two extremes. 1. A game is too small or demos poorly enough for the gaming zeitgeist to all but disregard their announcement until the games are actually close to being finished and released. Or 2. A game is so big and or looks so good in its announcement trailer that people excuse the blatant disregard for a publisher's obvious cash grabby early announcements out of sheer excitement for the possibilities. Look to any given Sony E3 conference or major Sony game presentation post the PS4 era for an example of this. They pretty much never announce games within a year of them coming out, and they rarely announce these games with release dates to begin with. And from their perspective, as a multi-billion-dollar corporation, why should they? They get the hype for the shiny new third-person action game and can plead ignorance when people bring up delays, since they technically didn't give a date to delay in the first place. How often do we see games get announced with CG trailers, many of which go through the additional effort of mocking up what UI elements will be to give the impression of real-time gameplay, only for that game to be reshown for years at multiple subsequent yearly events, or worse, depending on your perspective of course, disappear altogether. Prior to this year, the most prominent example on my mind has been Kingdom Hearts 3, upon its initial announcement, and funnily enough, that is becoming a trend with Square Enix repeating the situation with Kingdom Hearts 4. Now, I personally don't particularly care for the aspect of this tactic that commenters on the internet tend to write about, being the exaggeration of visual fidelity when compared to the final product, but it's definitely indicative of the larger problem. All that these announcements do is generate free mind share and exaggerate accomplishments for publishers while also exaggerating the expectations for fans. Or far worse than this is when these games look like a grander experience in their initial reveal, only to later be scaled down in scope when the game finally releases. ReCore being the prominent example in my mind here. All of that said, there have been a few well-intentioned super preemptive announcements. Take Metroid Prime 4 for instance. While it ended up being announced much further out than I think is reasonable, that was a game that I think had a very good case for an early announcement, assuming Nintendo actually did believe in the widely rumored original Prime 4 developer Bandai Namco Singapore's ability to deliver in a reasonable amount of time, but that's neither here nor there. The main reason I think Nintendo announcing Metroid Prime 4 half a decade ago, when I shake my fist at the aforementioned Square Enix example, or more commonly Sony doing something hopefully less extreme with games like God of War Ragnarok, or more recently Marvel Spider-Man 2 or Wolverine, being revealed with nebulous release dates at best. That reason being, Nintendo Switch's unprecedented momentum, Metroid Prime Federation Force, depending on who you ask, Metroid Prime Other M, and Metroid 2 Samus Returns. Or to put it more plainly, Nintendo spent a long period of time either in complete silence regarding Metroid or releasing games that Metroid fans hated. Fast forward to E3 2017 when Nintendo planned to announce a remake of a decades-old Metroid game for their sunsetting handheld, and they felt like in order to stick that landing, they needed to say something that would without a doubt preemptively shut up bitter fans that may feel like this upcoming game doesn't cater to them. In other words, the promise of dessert is the best incentive for vegetables. That said, even when well-intentioned, this strategy is liable to backfire because, as we're all aware, this one good example ended in the game getting delayed. And now here we are living in a world where God of War will likely have received 2 new entries in the style of the fan favorite soft reboot. Check out Parker's video on those while I'm on the topic, by the way, before Metroid Prime 4 comes out in God only knows how many more years. So while I agree Nintendo made the right call to keep Metroid fans in high spirits after being shafted for so long, and in turn partially paved the way for the assumed success of the 3DS remake and the definite success of Metroid Dread, it put Prime 4 in an awkward situation where it now needs to be borderline industry leading to be in the good graces of fans that waited for more than half a decade since its initial announcement. So what do we do about it? Well, I'd imagine this would become common sense, but given the lack of it happening, it's apparently not. Announce games when they're done, or at least when there's light very close to the end of the tunnel. In the modern era, games don't need a long runway to take off, and in fact, I'd argue that with current attention spans, most games are negatively impacted by a long hype cycle. Ironically, the smaller the game is, the less I care to be on the hype train for more than a few months tops. On the contrary, when a brand new game is announced and confirmed to be released within 4 months or so of the reveal, sign me up. As far as big games, take the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Does it benefit from a long hype cycle? Maybe. Does it need it? Definitely not. There's absolutely no need for this game to be promoted for this long. Honestly, the only real advantage to having a years-long wait for a follow-up to a game as massive as Breath of the Wild is to give people that are interested but haven't played the original time to do so. And even that isn't liable to happen in any real capacity because the marketing has been more geared toward mystery and intrigue. Why is there no sale for the original game urging latecomers to get caught up? Likely missing because the sequel was announced to garner hype and reap the stock price related benefits. The true solution really has nothing to do with publishers and their marketing teams, or at least the likely one. Truly, the onus is on the fan base to realize the way they react at large to this tactic actively encourages it to continue. Don't get me wrong, reacting positively to a game being delayed is a surprisingly reasonable response for the gaming community. Developers should be given all of the time they need to make the game they want to make. What isn't reasonable, though, is the continued premature announcement of the games in the first place, and it honestly feels gross that they make these announcements knowing that the end result will be positive for that inevitable delay. It's worth mentioning that many developers working on these top secret products yearn for the day when they can share the news with the world because they're proud of what they've done, and I empathize with that. But I don't think that dopamine hit from preemptive announcements is worth the added pressure of delaying a game that was hyped up for so long. Ever heard of Cyberpunk 2077? Obviously, there are still legitimate reasons games are announced and later delayed, but I personally feel like delays happen as often as they do, not so much because of bad management on the development side, but rather because of scummy tactics required from the top down on the marketing side. We gotta stop popping off for these games with obvious nebulous release timing. If we don't give these companies the monetary incentive to use these tactics, if we don't give publishers a metaphorical W for simply announcing the theoretical existence of a game, we put their feet to the fire to only announce games when they're ready to be rolled out and released. Being hyped can be fun. I, as a YouTuber and Twitch streamer, have a lot to gain from hype, but as a gamer, I think being hyped for extended periods of time negatively affects my experience 100% of the time, and is of benefit to me 0. We live in an era where shadow drops can generate millions, if not billions of dollars in revenue in the entertainment cycle at large. So what's the point of trying to continuously milk the hype cycle other than to reap the, in my opinion, ill-gotten benefits? I'd be interested to hear thoughts in the comments to the contrary, or additional supporting points as well if there's something I'm missing. Respectfully, of course. If you want to support this channel, check out our Patreon to see if any of the available tiers are a good fit for you. If you want to hang out with the community, our free to join Discord server is linked in the description alongside that and our social media accounts. Above all, subscribe to Redirect and ring the bell to be notified when new videos go live. Okay, that's it for me. See you in the next video.